Hello, and welcome to Chapter 5. I apologize last week for not being able to do a lecture, but I wanted to go ahead and finish this one up for Chapter 5. So, this week, or this module, we are actually talking about privacy. And essentially, what's the value of privacy to human beings, to society, and people who could possibly be put in the face of the media? So, a couple of things. First, we want to talk about the fact that from a personal standpoint and from a societal standpoint, um, we need privacy to be able to develop a sense of ourselves. We need to, for example, Constance Fisher talks about we need to be able to try out ourselves, new poses, future selves. We need to be able to do things like dance in a mirror or things like that without anybody being able to see us, and that helps us develop our personality, our sense of ourselves apart from human observation. We get to try out those silly things we want to do, so that when we get in front of a crowd, like dancing, that then we can do that. Now there's other much more profound things other than just learning dance moves, but just so that we understand, privacy allows us to be ourselves, and when there's too much of that taken away from us, we can't really be ourselves. We also need privacy in a sense that we need to be able to be away from the power of our government, or the state, as we would say. And the danger is, as this entity, the state, gains more information about us as citizens, could become more easy to influence, manipulate, or control. And this is, according to Neville, exactly why the founding fathers wanted limitations on the power of a state, and why they created even such things as the Bill of Rights, to help protect our private life from intrusion. So, we're going to talk about privacy from an ethical standpoint in this chapter, but there are legal standings that deal with what is privacy. In a civil court, you could sue someone for invading somebody else's privacy. There's not a lot. I don't know how many criminal laws there are involved in privacy, but I know that from a civil standpoint, you are able to sue people for invading your privacy. So, and what do those look like? It would be an intrusion on a person's seclusion or solitude, such as going into someone's home or going into their personal papers to get a story as a journalist. Disclosing embarrassing private information. For example, revealing someone's notorious past when it's not really newsworthy. It doesn't have any bearing on that person's present status. It's also illegal. Well, there's a legal standing if we put publicity on someone in a false light. So if we want to call out someone's goodness or badness, and we want to write a book about them, there is such a thing as holding someone in a way that they might be held as contemptible in society if you say enough false things about them. And then finally, another legal kind of standing for privacy is that you can't just take somebody's name or likeness and use it to sell something if they don't want you to. Now, with the way the internet is, sometimes you can be put as a spokesman for something that you aren't even being paid for, or you have no idea exists, just due to the ability of organizations to manipulate information. But there is a remedy. There's a legal remedy for that, which says that you cannot, for example, you couldn't take Julia Roberts' image to sell a product that she has not given you permission to sell. But from a ethical standpoint, we want to talk about responsibility and who has the responsibility to leave individual people's information private when it needs to be, and but also at the same time have the ability to expose issues that are a concern to society, or something that is dangerous, or something that is problematic. So that someone is a has been arrested for an act like assault or child molestation, if that could be a factor in something that they're doing now, we have to decide what level of right to privacy do they have to keep that kind of information hidden from other people or secret. But what was kind of interesting to me about this chapter is it also talks about not just your responsibility to keep things private and away from other people, but sometimes as a community we have an obligation to avert our eyes. And we don't seem to be very interested in doing that a lot of times. We have whole industries like TMZ or People Magazine or Entertainment Tonight that are basically, their whole purpose is to put our eyes on things that aren't necessarily anything that is of real value to us. And legal scholar Jeffrey Rosen says that that's actually something we should be doing sometimes. We should not be looking at people all of the time, and they have a right to be. People have a right to not be watched, and that's kind of a interesting concept that we don't really think about a lot, with the fact that our new technology allows us to be observed almost anytime someone wishes to observe us. So, but this was an interesting concept that I read in this chapter that I wanted to bring up, is this idea that sometimes we have an obligation to not ask or not look for information that has no bearing on what's going on around us. And what's the harm if someone's privacy is invaded? Well, according to Vanderhoeven, there's a such thing as informational harm. So if someone breaks into your private account of your bank and steals your identity, or steals your money out of your account, or gets a loan in your name when you've not agreed to that, in that case, that's informational harm. Your identity or your income or your your wealth as a human being can be damaged. Vanderhoeven also talks about informational inequality. So, for example, the NSA, the National Security Agency, and also Amazon or Google, they have the ability to gather huge amounts of information about us, but we don't necessarily have a right to information about their company in some cases. I thought it was very interesting in the video, the TED Talk that I posted for this module, that the speaker talks about this idea of people like Mark Zuckerberg saying privacy is dead, and yet they do everything they can as these billionaires to hide from and allow themselves privacy by owning multiple homes, or buying. I think in one case he mentioned that one person bought multiple properties around the home that they bought, so that people couldn't kind of look in on them and invade their privacy. So this idea that privacy is dead as long as you have enough money to invade other people's privacy is kind of an interesting idea to me. This idea that as long as I'm making money at it, privacy is dead, but if you want to invade my privacy, well, you can't do that. There's also such a thing as taking someone's information and maybe transferring it to a local newspaper without any idea of the value of that information. So maybe someone has decided to investigate you as a politician if you're taking bribes or something like that. Well, that doesn't give them the right to go into your financial records and then publish those records, and not necessarily explain what people are looking at. Kind of do the finger pointing thing. Ooh, look, there's a transaction that looks really really bad. But first of all, maybe we shouldn't have this information, these financial records in the first place. And second of all, are you giving us all the information that shows us whether this transaction was legal or illegal? So invading someone's privacy can create informational injustice. And then finally, as we were speaking about earlier, this idea that we have a right to shape our sense of ourselves, what Van den Hoven talks about as the capacity to shape our own moral biographies, to reflect our own careers, evaluate and identify our own moral choices without someone interfering or watching us while we're doing that. We have a right to a part of our life that isn't being monitored by other people. And Hodges, a philosopher, came up with this idea of circles of intimacy. Now, if you're a communications major, you may have seen a similar idea when we talk about this idea of layers of information or layers of privacy, and this idea that you have a right to things that are yours. That you have a right to have information that you only share with people that are most intimate to you, or only with your friends, or only with your acquaintances, and at some level even with people you've just met. What was interesting recently was there was a person who went out with some friends who were reporters and gave some information about their boss, and from them with the understanding that it was going to be private and nobody would share it. Well, the problem was that she went out with a bunch of reporters. Her friend, who was the reporter, had agreed to allow things to be private, but not everybody else in the room had allowed or had taken the same kind of oath, as it were, to keep this information private. So this person revealed a bunch of information about their personal interactions with their boss, and what ended up happening was that information was revealed and that person lost their job. So we have to understand, first of all, that as reporters we have an obligation to ask people, if you're going to tell me this information, do you expect me to keep it to myself, or do you am I allowed to work with this information? And sometimes reporters will use deception, and I'm not sure where I come down on that. I think there are some places where using deception to get at vital pieces of information, whether employees are being abused or human beings are being put into the slave trade or something like that, maybe we can justify deceiving someone to find out that information, but just deceiving someone to get information about their personal life that has nothing to do with wrongdoing, I'm not sure that that's something we have a right to. So one of the purposes of this idea of the circles of intimacy is this idea that we're going to invade people's private life when we are a journalist, and sometimes we do that purposefully, and sometimes we do it accidentally. We can reveal a piece of information we didn't know was going to be damaging. But understanding this concept of the circles of intimacy allows us to consider the rights and needs of others and kind of balance those against the demands of society. And sometimes we have to decide when an issue is newsworthy. So, do we want to release the name of a child who was killed in an accident? Or should we release the name of a child who's killed in an accident? We should, we need to talk to the parents. We need to make them understand why we might want to give the name, or why we might want to show a picture of the accident or a portion of the accident. But if we're going to make decisions about the kind of information we're going to put out there in front of people, we have to have an understanding that everything isn't just open game just because we want the information. And that comes down to this idea that sometimes invasion of privacy is justified, and in other situations it may not be. And part of your ethical growth as a journalist, if you become a journalist, is knowing when do the rules apply and when should we make exceptions. Now, what information do we need, or what are we allowed? So it's interesting, in this chapter they talk about this idea of concepts of right to know, want to know, and need to know. So the first one we'll deal with is this idea of right to know. This is actually a legal term, and it's associated with open meetings or open record statutes, laws that say that if a specific arm of the government or part of legislature or state or city or whatever is doing something that affects the people in that community, then the courts have ruled over time that the people have a right to know that, and if the people have the right to know that, newspapers and other publications have the right to put that information out there. So journalists have the same legal right to public information that other people do, and the right to disseminate that information as it is needed to help people understand what's going on around them. This is where we kind of talk about this idea that journalists can be a vital part of our democracy. We need to know what's going on in our community, in our Board of Education, at our state legislature. The next one is kind of a philosophy of need to know. So, and what that says is, in order for our democracy to really work, one of the functions of mass media is to provide information that allows citizens to go about their life and understand what's going on around them, to give them context, to give them a surveillance mode, a way of seeing what are the people up in Washington doing, what are the people in our state legislature doing, what are people who are involved in criminal activity, what are they doing? So there is, or even just things like what's the weather, or how should I best invest my money? Those are kind of all things that could fall under this kind of idea of we need to know them, and the public needs to know them, and they should be provided to the public so that they have an ability to make good decisions, to see what's going on around them, to decide who they want to vote for or don't want to vote for, and those kind of things. So this idea of need to know says in order for our society to function, there's pieces of information out there, some less important, like the weather, and some more important, like corruption in politics, that we need to know about. And then finally, what they classified in the textbook as kind of the least compelling rationale is people want to know. And you'll hear people who are involved in entertainment reporting say, the public wants to know, and that's not really a compelling argument for invading someone's privacy. As a matter of fact, I think it's important that when you're reading the case study that you think about this idea of want to know, need to know, and right to know. The case study has to do with a former celebrity from the 80s, Richard Simmons, and someone who created a podcast for the and he ended up chasing Richard Simmons around. But or chasing information about Richard Simmons around. So it's a very interesting case, and has to do a lot with these three concepts that we just talked about. Which is, and they finally say about this, and while we may want information about a lot of different things, there's certain stuff we just don't have any right to. So, finally, how do we decide which information is fair to be exposed and which should stay private? Well, and that's a difficult question, because if you're biased to one group of people or another, or one political party or another, or something like that, you're usually going to say, well, my opponent doesn't deserve the same level of privacy. Or you might be tempted to say, my opponent doesn't have, or the person on the other side of the issue doesn't have the same right to privacy that I do. But what John Rawls proposed was this idea of the veil of ignorance. So if we're going to make decisions about society fairly and without bias, in order to make sure everybody's kind of treated the same way, you have to use this kind of thought exercise. The veil of ignorance says you need to make decisions about what's fair and not fair to everyone, with the presupposition that you don't know your place in society. So you don't know if you're going to be born to a wealthy family or a poor family. You don't know if you're going to be born, in some societies you might have been born as a slave or an owner. So all of those perspectives would change your way of thinking what's fair and unfair. So what Rawls kind of says when we're making decisions is that we need to kind of put that aside and think about what's fair and unfair as if we don't know what place we would have in that society. And that makes people much less likely to say something should be fair for me, but I don't care if it's fair for somebody else. And what that allows us to do is, so that when we make decisions about what's fair and what's not, we don't necessarily, so that in a case, a poor single mother's rights to privacy would be the same as someone with unlimited resources. So it's just a way of looking at what's fair and what's not fair. And it's kind of a little bit of it's a philosophical concept, so it's a little bit complicated. So I have included a video about the veil of ignorance as well, kind of a brief description of it from one of Stephen Fry's BBC programs. And it's very interesting, so I'd encourage you to look at that as well. All right, well, thank you. And this is the lecture for Chapter 5, and I hope if you have any questions, or if you enjoyed it or you did not like it, you let me know, and I'll do things to try and help fix these lectures as the semesters go on. Thank you.